Hello, everyone. Welcome to this talk titled An Imposter's Guide to Growth in Engineering. My name is Ebun Segun, and I will be taking you through this talk today. Now, first, let's start with a little about me. I am a software engineer by profession. I've spent most of my career building software for trains and railway transportation for fintech and analyzing the stock market for investors, and most recently, e-commerce at Shopify. I am also a writer. I have a blog, which is my little corner of the internet where I write about life, personal development, career development, and quite frankly, anything that pops into my head because it's mine. I also contribute to Shopify's engineering blog once in a while. I have a degree in computer science and biomedical computing, and I'm very passionate about the study of the mind and the brain and how these both function. Now, the goal of today's talk is to gain a deeper understanding of imposter syndrome in relation to growth and how you can grow in your engineering career while experiencing imposter syndrome. We're going to start first by looking at imposter syndrome. We're going to define what it is, what it isn't also, and then we're going to look at some symptoms of imposter syndrome in relation to engineering. Then we're going to do a brief segue into the comfort and growth zones in relation to imposter syndrome. And we're going to do a fun science segment of the biology of imposter syndrome because, like I said, the goal of this talk is to gain a deeper understanding of imposter syndrome. And then I'm going to give you some practical tools to help you not just cope, but also grow through imposter syndrome. And then we're going to conclude, and I'll take any questions if you have any. So if this sounds about right, we're going to get into the talk now. But first, what is all the fuss about imposter syndrome? Now, by show of hands, how many of you here have heard about imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon? Okay, almost every hand. That's perfect. I'm in the right place. And how many of you have experienced this at least once in your life? Okay, I'm definitely in the right place. But the point that I'm trying to establish by asking these questions is that imposter syndrome is a relatively common thing that happens to everyone. And honestly, even if no one raised their hands in this room right now, I would still say that same statement because this room is not an accurate representation of the 8 billion people that exist on the planet. So yes, I'm not going to be the first to say this, and I'm not going to be the last, but I'll say this again. Imposter syndrome is very common. But we're going to take a closer look at this. Now, for the purpose of this talk, I will define imposter syndrome as an overwhelming feeling of inadequacy despite evident success. Now, I want you to take note of that last phrase, despite evident success, because it sort of denotes that you've done something and you've achieved a bit of success in your career so far. You've had a few years or a lot of years under your belt where you have shipped some awesome features. You know, you've made some findings that have been revolutionary at your workplace. So kudos to you for that. Now, I'll pause here and say that if you are earlier in your career, if you are more on the junior level or just fresh out of college or boot camp or whatever pipeline you use to enter tech, that overwhelming feeling that you have might not be imposter syndrome. It just might be because there's a lot of things that you have to learn. That overwhelming feeling might come from the fact that there's a sheer large amount of things that you don't know. And I'll pause and say that at this point, what you need to do is actually throw yourself into learning. Learn as much as you can, keep coding, keep pairing with people, find the people that have the skills that you want and pair with them and talk to them and learn from them. But if you're at that stage in your career where you have achieved a measurable amount of success and you still feel like an imposter, this talk is for you. Now, on the right, I have this diagram. It's a tree, but I'm gonna call this the imposter syndrome tree. And at the roots of this tree, I have 3 feelings associated with imposter syndrome. So I have self-doubt, incompetence, and fear. And of course, this is not an exhaustive list of all the feelings that you feel when experiencing imposter syndrome. But I'm just gonna stick with these 3 for now. And at the top of this tree, we have the leaves, or some statements that people experiencing imposter syndrome say. So statements like, I feel like a fraud, or other people think I'm smarter than I am, or I'm afraid I will disappoint everyone, or I don't think I can do this. Now, you might be sitting here and saying, well, I'm an engineer and I don't really say these types of things. But there are some unique symptoms of imposter syndrome that engineers face. And we're gonna look at some of those today. So the first one is not speaking or asking questions. So picture this. You've been asked to be part of a new project. There's a new challenge that your workplace wants to tackle. And you've been asked to be part of that. So you're in a meeting, like you're in a planning meeting with other engineers, key stakeholders, some experts, your colleagues. And while you're seated at the table, metaphorically and physically, you just refuse to talk. You don't say anything, you don't ask any questions, not just because you don't know what to say, but also because you don't want other people to think that you're a fraud. So you just don't ask any questions. Another symptom is always agreeing with what others say. So picture this again, you're in that meeting and you know the people that are considered experts or the intelligent people in your mind, they hear someone say something and so they smile and they nod their heads and you smile and you nod your head as well, because surely if the intelligent people think that that is a wise thing or something great has been said, you want to also seem like you're intelligent and you know what you're saying. So you smile and you nod your head as well. How many people have done that? Because I most definitely have. I'm not ashamed to say that I've done that in the past. Another symptom is just always feeling nervous when you have to talk about your work. So somebody asks you, oh, what are you up to these days? What are you working on now? And you quickly gloss over 2 or 3 sentences telling them what you're working on, and then you quickly throw the question back to them, how about you? What are you working on? And you talk them out of asking you any questions about your work again. That right there is a symptom of imposter syndrome. And you're nervous to talk about your work because you feel like the more you talk, the more people will think that you're a fraud. Another symptom is always having a long to-do list or a long list of things that you have to go learn right after every meeting because you don't want people to ask you about this next time and you don't have the answer to that. So you just gather, while you're having the meeting, you have your notes and you're scribbling like, okay, somebody said I see, and somebody said this and that. So you have to go learn what that means. Now let me pause and also say that I don't know, but I can figure it out is a valid response. And so we need to use that more often. Another symptom of imposter syndrome is looking for other things to succeed at. And I'm not saying that multitasking is wrong, but I'm also saying that you need to examine the motive behind looking for other things to succeed at. Now, if you are squashing 72 bugs a day because you want people to think that you've been productive and you don't want them to ask you how much you've done in this new project, then that right there might be a symptom of imposter syndrome. So you're not focusing too much on the project that you have at hand because it seems too difficult. But then when someone asks you, say, oh, I squashed 100 bugs today, you know, I was so busy, all of that. That right there is a symptom of imposter syndrome. And the last one that I'm going to examine is code perfectionism. And I define this as that state where you take your sweet time in making sure your code is absolutely perfect. And before you put out that pull request, you want to make sure that you have all your code has no spots and no blemishes. And the reason is because you don't want people to find out that maybe you struggled a little bit with figuring out what to write in the first place. So those last two symptoms for me, those are my default symptoms whenever I'm experiencing imposter syndrome. I always look for other things to succeed at, and I practice code perfectionism. And whenever I notice these two things, I just know that I'm in a weird phase of imposter syndrome. But with everything I've just said right now, is imposter syndrome a bad thing? Now, I know that I'm in a room full of smart people who can tell that this is a trick question. So I know that you know that the answer to this question is no. Imposter syndrome is not always a bad thing. Now, when people explain imposter syndrome and talk about it, it's always as a vice or this thing that you have to overcome. And they say things like you just have to have the confidence and you need to know that you can do it. And while that is not wrong, imposter syndrome can be an indicator that you are approaching the growth zone. So basically, imposter syndrome exposes the fact that there's something that you don't know and you're in unfamiliar territory, and it makes you uncomfortable. However, it's exposing an area of growth for you. Now, on Monday, when Chelsea asked how many people were experiencing imposter syndrome, a lot of hands went up, including mine. But I want you to pause and reconsider the fact that even if you feel like a fraud just being in this room, it's possibly your body's way of telling you that there's something you don't know. And there are lots of smart people here with great talks that can teach you those things you don't know. And so you need to be open to learn those things. Now, in this diagram that I have, which I call the zones, I have 3 concentric circles right here. Right in the middle, the smallest circle in red is labeled the comfort zone. Right outside that, in yellow, I have the weird zone. And right in that weird zone, this is where I have feelings like fear, doubt, incompetence, and those feelings associated with imposter syndrome. And then right outside that weird zone is the growth zone. Now, when your comfort zone is your zone of neutral performance. So in this zone, you're not gaining any net new skills, but you're good at your job. You can do whatever you have to do. You know the piece of code to touch. You know everything that you have to do. You could basically write the code in your sleep. You can build the features in your sleep. You know exactly what you're supposed to do, and you're working on cruise control, basically. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing, but you're not gaining any new skills. Now, as we can see from this diagram, whenever you attempt to learn a new skill, whenever you are faced with an opportunity to grow, or whenever you have a new challenge or a new project that you have to work on at work, you are attempting to step outside of your comfort zone into your growth zone. And as we can see, it's almost impossible to go from your comfort zone to your growth zone without encountering that weird zone, or what I like to call the imposter syndrome zone. Now, I say almost impossible because, quite frankly, some people are superhumans and they do not experience imposter syndrome. But for me, I sure do. I'm a normal person who, anytime I decide to step out of my comfort zone, I feel a little uncomfortable. And so from this diagram, we can make a deduction that imposter syndrome lives at the bridge between your comfort zone and your growth zone. And so if we take all these feelings associated with imposter syndrome, we take the doubt, the inadequacy, the incompetence, the fear, what have you, we can package these into a box in your body known as your mood. So these things sort of make up your mood. And in the human body, your mood is regulated by this neurotransmitter known as serotonin. So by show of hands, how many of you have heard about serotonin? Okay, this is quite a large number. I'm in the right room. I'm definitely in the right room. You might have heard of it in relation to sleep or digestion or a host of other functions that it has. But serotonin is a neurotransmitter in the body that is responsible for regulating your mood, but it's also largely associated with social importance and the feelings of status and respect. Now, research has shown that imposter syndrome is related to low serotonin in your body. So we can make another deduction here that if imposter syndrome is related to low serotonin, then in order to battle imposter syndrome, you need to boost your serotonin. Is that right? Is my math correct? Would you agree to that? Yes, okay, I see some thumbs up, I see some head shakes. It's okay. I'll show you though. I'll show you. So, like I said, in order to cope and grow through imposter syndrome, you require a serotonin boost as just a base level. Now, I'm not a doctor yet or a dietitian, so I can't tell you what foods to eat to boost up your serotonin, but I can give you some practical tools that will help you to do this. And some of these tools are growth tools, some of these tools are coping tools. But I hope that you will learn something through these tools that I'm giving you. So the first tool that I'm going to mention is to figure out your significance in your team or your project. So to put this in another way, you need to figure out the importance of your role and your contribution to the new challenge that you've been presented with. So think about why you were considered to be part of this new team. Why were you considered for this role? Like, are there any skills that you have that would be beneficial to this new project? So I have a personal story. Every 9 months, give or take, every once in a while at work, I ask my manager for a new challenge because I look at my professional development plan and I look at the things that I'm not so strong at. I also look at the whole company and I identify skills that I want to learn. And so I ask my manager to find me or assign me to a project where I can learn those skills. Now, the last time I asked my manager for a new challenge, I think he took me a little too seriously because he gave me the mother of all challenges. And honestly, it took me weeks, several weeks, or even months to find my bearing in this new team and with this new challenge. At some point, I got to a crossroad where I had to decide if I wanted to go back to my comfort zone. And at that time, my comfort zone was front-end development with React, or if I wanted to step into my growth zone. And that growth zone for me was learning Ruby and learning Rails. And now most of you are probably thinking the obvious answer is go to your growth zone, duh. But it wasn't that easy to make that decision. But two things helped me make that decision to go to my growth zone instead. So the first thing was I realized that this wasn't my first time asking my manager for a new challenge. And every time I had asked him for one, he knew that I didn't have the skills for that yet, and I would go through that weird phase of low productivity and just feeling weird. And eventually, I would come out on the other side having shipped a great product with the rest of the team. And so I had to really think about the fact that he was aware of the changes that I would go through, and he was aware of how weird it would be, but he still trusted me to be able to perform in the end. But then the second thing that helped me make this decision was the fact that I was talking to a member of a senior leadership team, and I was basically trying to explain the reason for my low productivity and just talking about how I was finding this new project so hard and it was so challenging and outside of my comfort zone and all of these other excuses. And yes, he acknowledged everything that I said, but he also made a statement. He said, when we were looking for new people to take on this new project, and we were looking for a new team to step into this domain and take this work, we knew that we were looking for capable hands. And so the fact that you are among the capable hands should say something to you about yourself. So I want you to go to, like, what he said, before I continue, what he said, it really helped me make that decision. And it helped me recognize the fact that other people saw my skills and they respected me for those. Now, even if I didn't know what I was supposed to do in Rails or Ruby by developing a new feature or a new product with that, what they knew was that what I lacked in skills, I made up for in my willingness to learn. One thing about me, I don't know everything, but I'm always willing to learn. And I will always put up my hand and say, I can do it. And so they realized that. And remember how I said that serotonin is linked to the feelings of respect and status that you get from others. Now that right there was a huge serotonin boost for me, because I started to realize that others saw me in a good light and they also recognized the skills that I had. Now, if you are facing imposter syndrome, I want you to go to your team lead and go to your project champion, go to your manager, and ask them why they think you would be great for this project. Why did they ask you to be part of this new project? What do they see in you? Ask them if they think that you have any skills that can be beneficial to this new challenge that you're facing. And if you're a manager or a team lead or project champion in this room, I want you to really think about this if someone comes to ask you these questions, because that could be a career-defining moment for them. So if someone asks you, what do you think I bring to the table, or why did you ask me to be a part of this project? Please be honest and be sincere with them and give them solid answers, because that could really help them. You never know if they're going through imposter syndrome. So that could really help them to shake it off. So I want you to actually think about and figure out your significance in your team or project. The next tip that I'm going to give, the next tool, is to notice the value of what you already know. Now, I'm a big believer in the fact that knowledge is transferable, no matter how big, no matter how small, no matter how different the domains are, no matter how different the programming languages are, knowledge is transferable. And by the definition of imposter syndrome, you have had some success in the past. So I want you to take all your learnings and all the work you've done in the past and look for how that fits into this new project and this new challenge. And I call that a hook. So I want you to pay attention, pay close attention to the hook and find that part where your previous knowledge fits in and leverage that. Once you find that sweet spot where you can contribute based on your previous knowledge, actually take that and contribute to the new project. Ask questions and just basically let it be known that you know something and you can be beneficial to this new project. Now, doing this will help to boost your confidence and lift your overall mood. Again, serotonin boost. I told you I could give you tips, and I'm going to continue doing that. The next tool that I have is to do the opposite of what you would normally do when experiencing imposter syndrome. So as I mentioned, my default symptoms of imposter syndrome are finding other things to succeed at and code perfectionism. So for me, what I did to tackle this was every day for a few months, I blocked out 3.5 hours in my day to only focus on the task at hand and this new project that I had to work on. So during that time block, I did not care about any other thing. I didn't care about fixing any bug. All I had to do was write some code. get a prototype, a working prototype, or some minimum testable code that I could present to the rest of the team, or I could put in a pull request. And so doing that alone was a way to tackle that finding other things to do aspect. I only had to focus on the project that I had to work on. And then to tackle the code perfectionism, I realized that I didn't know much about developing in Ruby and in Rails, but other people and other team members, they knew a lot. And so I wanted to learn from them, and I wanted to grow in my skills. And so I would get my code to a working state as much as I could, and I would just put up the pull request. I always time boxed my coding, and I would put up a pull request and open myself up to all the feedback and all the comments and all the constructive criticism about my work, knowing fully well that the purpose of that was to learn. I didn't want anyone to think that my code was perfect. I let it be known that I struggled, and I don't know what I was doing here, and I saw this pattern in another file, so I copied that because I wanted to learn and I wanted to grow. So I want you to think of the symptoms that you express whenever you are facing imposter syndrome. Now, if for you it is being silent or not speaking, I want you to ask at least one question, even if it's to just clarify what someone else said. Just ask one question, say something. Now, if for you it is feeling nervous about your work, when you have to talk about your work, I want you to talk to your work I wanted you to talk to someone else, at least one person, about your work. And maybe pick someone that doesn't have any context about the work that you're doing. Let them poke and let them ask other questions. Let them pick your brain and see if you can answer those questions, or at least try. And this brings me to my next point. And this is a growth tool. Be proud of what you have done and share it. And I'll show you how this can be a huge serotonin booster for you. Whenever you decide to share some new knowledge, so let's say you started contributing to this new challenge, you started contributing to this new project, and you've written some pretty neat code, something you consider neat, or you found a missing piece of the puzzle because let's say you're working on this new project that is a huge unknown for the company, and there's some unknowns, there's some questions. You found a missing piece of the puzzle. I want you to first give yourself a pat on the back, because you did something. You did that. But then after you've done this, I want you to look for an outlet to share this. Because it's been proven that knowledge sharing is a huge way for growth. Because I don't know about you, but every time I consider sharing knowledge or sharing my new findings with someone, I take extra care in doing more research to make sure that what I'm sharing is factual, it's correct. And by constantly doing that research and constantly going over what you have to share, you are crystallizing this new knowledge in your brain. You're giving your brain the opportunity to absorb that. But then also, when you share knowledge with others, you are giving them the opportunity to approve what you have found, to validate it, or to even just bring alternative opinions to the table, which in turn will help everybody grow. As the person who is increasing the total body of knowledge available in the world, can you see how that gets you some sort of status and respect with others? Can you see how by sharing knowledge, you've sort of, not in a straight line, but you've increased your social importance, because people can recognize that you found something, you learned something, and you're sharing that with others. Again, serotonin booster right there. I told you that I had tips for you to help you increase your serotonin. So if you have found something new and you've written some pretty neat code that you think will be helpful for others, I want you to share it. So if you have show and tells, if you have internal presentations, do that. If you can write some documentation and share with the rest of your team, also do that. And if you're like me who loves to write, you'll write an article about that. So this was an article that I recently published on Shopify's engineering blog, where I wrote about how we created a flexible order routing system with Shopify functions. And this brings me to my last tool, is to throw yourself into a difficult task. Now, I know this might be a little counterintuitive because you're going into the growth zone. You don't really have the skills. You don't know what you're doing. But a great way and a really fast way to learn is by doing. So I want you to go to your GitHub board and look for something that is very unfamiliar with you, like you don't know what this is about, and assign that to yourself. Or if you have a team champion, ask them to assign that to you. And the truth is, somewhere down the line, you will have to do this same work or something similar to that at some point. But by assigning yourself this difficult task early on, you're basically doing all that groundwork and heavy lifting. You are pushing yourself to grow in your skills so that down the line, when you have to touch that piece of code again, or when you have to go into that domain, you kind of already are familiar and you know what to do. Now, when you approach a difficult task with a blank slate of knowledge, you are giving yourself the opportunity to approach mastery level quicker. And it's the hard things that challenge you and help you grow, not the easy things. So I want you to throw yourself into a difficult task and grow through that. Now, with everything that I've said and with all the tips that I've given, I don't want to miss the opportunity to tell you to be open and honest, first with yourself and how uncomfortable you feel, but then also with others, with your colleagues, with your managers. Because when you're open and honest, you'll figure out that a lot of people actually don't know what they're doing, and they're figuring things out as well. And if you would just ask, you'd be surprised at how many people would say, I don't know, but I'm willing to figure that out. Now, in one way or another, we are all imposters, but some people just have better tools and better ways to navigate the feeling. And so I hope that with this talk, I've given you some tools to add to your toolbox next time you're facing imposter syndrome. Now, this talk and the tools that I've given, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. So feel free to drop anything that does not work for you. But if you find that something is helpful, add it to your toolbox so the next time you're facing imposter syndrome, you have some tools that can help you navigate, not just cope with it, not just shake it off, but to also grow in your engineering career or whatever career you have actually. Now, thank you for listening. You can find me on LinkedIn at Ebun Segun. That's my full name. Or you can check out my website, www.ebunoluwasegun.com, where I talked about I have those articles that I talked about on that website. And I also share what I'm currently reading, because I read a lot. Now, thank you again for listening. And if you have any questions for me, I can take those now. Otherwise, thank you once again. Nice. So the question was, how do I handle failure in terms of overdoing? Because I suggested throwing yourself into a difficult task and how that can lead to burnout, right? And how do I handle failure? Honestly speaking, there's this thing called a growth mindset and the fixed mindset. How many of you have heard of that? Okay. So the growth mindset states that, like, you don't have all the skills, but you can gain those skills through trying and through effort. And sometimes your effort does not always lead to success. Sometimes it can lead to burnout, but failure is not failure. It's not on you. It's a learning opportunity. So if I've attempted something and I failed, I'm honestly not ashamed to admit that, okay, this didn't turn out the way I wanted, but what did I learn from that? But then in all of that, I also go to people that I know that they know these things. And I do a lot of pair programming and all of that because I try to learn from people to minimize how much effort that I have to do by myself, which can lead to burnout. If I always feel like I have to do everything by myself, that's not a healthy way for me to deal with things. And so I go to other people and I learn from them. I pair program a lot. I ask all the questions. In fact, at work, I let it be known that I'm the person who asks silly questions. I'm not ashamed. If I don't understand something, no matter if I think it sounds silly, I will ask that question. I will ask, what does this mean? So yeah, that's how I deal with just burnout and all of that. I try to minimize how much work that I force myself to do alone. I hope that answers your question. Awesome. Right. So the question is, if by definition imposter syndrome says that you've had evident success, how do you know that you've had that success, even if you do not feel successful? The quick answer I'll give you is performance reviews. Actually look back at what your managers and what your team leads have said about you in the past. Look at those areas of strength, look at those areas of weakness, look at those areas that they've mentioned and they've highlighted. Look at what they said you've done. That is objective. It's not about you saying, I'm successful, I've done this. This one, you have feedback from someone else who has evaluated your performance. And that's how you can figure out what your evident success is. So does that answer your question?
That helps.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so the question and comment was that we were talking 2 days ago, and I had mentioned that I was from Nigeria originally, and then I moved to Canada for school. And so he was just asking that, how does moving from a new country affect how you feel imposter syndrome? The truth is, it affects it by a lot. It actually does multiply it because for me, it was a whole new system. It was a different way of working. In Nigeria, the way of working is not the same as in Canada. Things are a lot stricter. Like you're at work to do your work. People dress formally most times, especially in the tech industry. Now it's getting better. You know, people are adopting this tech bro persona of your gray t-shirt and all of that. However, generally the way of working in Nigeria is a lot harder, and you're just supposed to do your work and be productive and get that done and whatnot. And so I had to actually realize that I was in a new country. And what's that saying, that when in Rome, behave like the Romans? When in Rome, act like, yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Yes. But yeah, you have to actually pause and realize that you're in a new place. And so you have to learn the way of life of this new place and learn how things are done. But then also, I'm a big advocate of communication. So talk to your team lead, talk to your manager about the adjustments that you have to make and how your life's experience and your previous experience is very different. And let them help you figure out how to navigate this. Like I mentioned in my talk, you have to be open and honest. I feel like that's the baseline level of dealing with imposter syndrome. You have to be honest with yourself about why you feel the way you do and identify that like you're in a different space and you're in a different situation. And then talk to people who can help you with that. If there are no more questions, I will say thank you once again for coming to my TED Talk.